Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, Endow women. I am here with Peter Burns, who is Government Relations Director at In Defense of Christians, which is a nonprofit organization that is near and dear to my heart because I was very much, in a very small way, involved with the founding of this organization in DC. Gosh, how long has it been? 2013, 2012?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
been a while, but Peter, I'm so happy that you've joined us today. It's just such a privilege and a gift that you're here, and I can't wait to introduce you to Endow women across America and the world. So we have Endow women all over the world, actually. So that's a huge gift. And so welcome. So Peter, tell us a little bit about IDC, just real quick, and your background. So, and then we'll head into a conversation, because today we're going to talk about religious freedom, which is a very important conversation to have. So we're actually going to have a series of conversations on religious freedom, because Endow, Peter, stands for, you probably already know this, but just in case you don't, educating on the nature and dignity of women. So religious freedom is a natural right that is part of our human dignity, part of our nature, the way that God created us. So this is a very important conversation to have, and we want women to get involved. So tell us a little bit about yourself and IDC briefly before we jump right in.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you so much for having me today. And in our interactions, I've learned a lot about the organization recently in Dow, and I'm so impressed and excited and honored to get to speak to your women all around the world. So it's a privilege. Thank you. IDC is a small nonprofit based in DC that represents Middle Eastern Christian communities, and its founders, who you know well, around the time when ISIS was really beginning to target Christian communities in the Middle East violently, viciously, and there wasn't any sort of attention being given to the issue here in Washington. And there was the realization that there needed to be a group that could be politically mobilized to raise this to the highest levels of government, raise this concern. And so that's where IDC stepped into the gap with many other partner groups and organizations, came together in just an incredible coalition. And actually, the outcome was a recognition that what was happening to Christians and Yazidis in northern Iraq and Syria was actually genocide being perpetrated by ISIS. And since then, you've just had a huge effort to try and sort of support Christian communities in the Middle East. And it was really timely in the sense that if you look at sort of just raw demographic data of Christian communities in the Middle East, these are, and just to context, and I'll stop with this, these are communities that have existed since the early church, since the early apostles went and proselytized in these parts of the Middle East, in northern Iraq and in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. If you look at the demographic data of these communities, they were declining at such a rapid rate through persecution, people being forced to migrate, direct violence, that they very well might have disappeared within our lifetimes. They might have been gone. Hundreds of year-old ancient churches, indigenous churches to these communities, to these regions. So it was sort of a fire bells in the night, and there's a huge amount of work being done. And I'll just sort of stop there as the initial.
Yeah, I mean, it was just that this impulse that this is really happening. These communities are getting obliterated, and there isn't really an organization that's dedicated. Because there are organizations that raise awareness of Christian persecution, Voice of the Martyrs, Open Doors, and other. Those are ones that I used to pay particular attention to. But there wasn't one that was as politically engaged as In Defense of Christians is.
That's right, and those are great. And the groups you just listed, and there's many more now. We've seen a really, I would say, sort of a renaissance in Washington, and I can share more about this. But really, the religious freedom issue, going back to the Clinton administration and before, even into the Reagan administrations, and sort of as modern U.S. foreign policy developed, questions of religious persecution were often put as secondary to questions of national security, sort of, international relationships. And often when you had a country that the U.S. was working with that committed some sort of heinous religious violation of one of their communities, minority communities often, the U.S. government would often, in the State Department and in the administrations, they would say, well, there's this national security interest, or there's this political interest that has to come first. And what we've seen actually under the current administration is a real changing in that narrative, which is an elevation of concern over religious freedom internationally, to a place where it is a priority foreign policy for the U.S. So it is now sort of at the table. It used to sort of be in the closet, we jokingly say, where it wasn't taken seriously. Now it really has a seat at the table in sort of the way U.S. policymakers and NGOs here in D.C. are thinking about and talking about these issues. So there's a number of great organizations really on the front line of this, doing great work, from all different faith communities around the world. So yeah, it's an exciting moment.
Yeah, I think also just to point out there that this is a bipartisan effort, and that religious freedom is a concern that all Christians should care about. And just a little personal note here, as a Middle Eastern Christian, I mean, when my family left the Middle East in the late 1960s, early 70s, it was out of prophetic, or not prophetic, but just prophetic in the sense of reading the signs of the cultural, social, and civil climate to the and my father and other people, kind of patriarchs of the family saying, something like ISIS will happen, and we don't want to be around for it. So it was not out of the sense of not having a love for our mother country, Egypt, but out of a sincere desire to be in the United States, in a place, in a climate that is religiously free, and to be able to worship God without fear. So when In Defense of Christians was kind of this thought coming up, or this intuition, or this thing arising from the hearts of the people who founded it, I felt as a Middle Eastern Christian American very, very loved that something that the government of my country, I love my country, I love my government, but that an issue that, as you mentioned, was in the closet is finally now taken seriously and out on the table, was very personally moving for me, because it is so much a part of my family's history and experience. So
yeah, and I think I'll just add to that. I think that a lot of I'm Protestant. I come from a Protestant background, and I was not aware of how large and vibrant Middle Eastern church diasporas in the U.S. often had to come here because of persecution. And we can talk more about that as well. But it's an incredible community, and it's all throughout society. Everyone, whether you realize it or not, you've interacted, you've engaged with these communities. And I'll say, just as an example, right now, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, is from a Maronite Lebanese background. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, is a Orthodox Lebanese background. So yeah, I heard him speak recently, and he talked about the fact that his family had a similar story to your family, where they came to the States pursuing a place where they could follow their conscience without fear of retribution. And this is something that the U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, often says, is that what we do with our soul is one of our fundamental human rights. It's like our first human right is the right to decide what we do with our own soul.
Right. It is the first right of the human soul to be in relationship with God, because that's the fundamental choice. That's what religious freedom is, setting up the circumstances for which an individual person can say, yes, Jesus Christ. If you're a Christian, I say yes to this partnership and collaboration with you, the Holy Spirit, and God the Father. And for everybody else to may not make that choice, but there needs to be at least the conditions for salvation. So
yeah, and I think as believers, as Christians, I think we can look at the situation and realize the beauty of religious freedom in that if we really believe what we really believe, right, that we are offering, we have gotten to be partners and children, of the actual Creator, and that there's this real vitality to our faith, then I think the best possible option is for there to be this open ability for us to share and learn and sort of, be in dialogue with people of other faiths. And I think there's actually that should not be threatening at all. I think sometimes people see sort of religious freedom when it, is sort of want it for their own community, but they feel threatened when it's sort of offered to other communities. I don't think we should have any reason to feel that way if we feel, if we truly believe we have the truth, then that's empowering. The open space for freedom, and in so many places, China right now is a great example where sort of any religious dialogue is absolutely suppressed. So I think that should be for believers, that should be what we pursue and should be empowering. Beyond sort of the broader human sort of right, but actually even just as Christians, I think that should be empowering to us. Religious freedom should be something we look at as a sort of a garden where the truth can flourish.
Exactly. So, and you're obviously with In Defense of Christians, the specialty is certain countries in the Middle East.
Yes.
That are most targeted. So for the benefit of our Endow women who are listening, can you educate us a little bit right now about this, you know, which countries should we be praying for? What situation should we be praying for? If you feel the need to bring in, you know, policy that's being worked on, and just to clarify, because we get kind of confused in this kind of all these things, is that In Defense of Christians, along with other organizations, do very well bringing up the awareness of the situation, what's happening. The real special sauce, I would say, and there have been quite in a number of victories that I want you to talk about, is that In Defense of Christians helped crafted policy that has been effective in protecting religious freedom and human rights in the Middle East. So could you tell us as Christian women, you know, which country should we be particularly interceding for? What the situation is there? What should we know as American Catholic women or as Endow women who are all over the world about your particular, because we're going to hone in on the Middle East, and particularly those countries in the Middle East that IDC deals with. So.
Yeah. Well, I'll share. There's, there are a few that are really near and dear where there are historic Christian communities that have suffered a lot recently, and I think it's helpful. I was really, really privileged to get to visit one of the areas that we've worked on the most, which is northern Iraq. It's referred to as the Nineveh Plain. This is where biblical Nineveh would have been, where the Assyrian Empire would have been. The early church proselytized in that region. It became a Christian region and has been so since. And I share that because I had an incredible experience that I think was just so illustrative of how deep these roots go. While I was in the Nineveh Plain, we got to go right up to the border with Turkey, which is a very mountainous area. It almost looks, I would say, almost like like Nevada or sort of arid sort of mountains. It's very beautiful. And so we go up in the mountains, and we went to this one-room church that is really like, it's extraordinary. It's built on the face of a cliff. I mean, it's this one-room little chapel that they built on the face of this cliff. And we have a guide with us who is in his 70s. He has a walking stick, but still very, active in the mountains all the time. And so he leads us up there, and he takes us out front, and on this cliff ledge, they have there is a little cemetery, and it's like 7 gravestones. And he says, the first gravestone here is, and we have an interpreter, and he said the first gravestone is my brother, who was the last priest in this church. And he said the gravestone next to that is my father. The gravestone next to that is my grandfather. And he goes down the line, and there was 7 generations of his family testifying, the message of Christ to this little mountain town in northern Iraq. And he's the caretaker of this church where they had been preaching the gospel for over, all told, it was close to 200 years, which is just what an incredible rich tradition. And I think a lot of people in the U.S. They don't maybe fully appreciate the desire and the richness of these communities and these traditions, and the desire to preserve them. I think a lot of people say, well, the Middle East is a majority Muslim region that has at times regularly throughout history turned violent towards Christians. Maybe they should just come to the U.S. And sort of our first message at IDC has always been, no, they should have the right and the space to continue to worship and live freely and safely in their own communities, because they're just such a rich, ancient, and deep roots there. So that was, when it comes to Iraq, what we saw was and I think everyone saw this on the news a few years back, was just ISIS targeting just for complete destruction and Christian communities having to flee their towns and villages. Since then, the U.S. government, obviously working with an international coalition, defeated ISIS territorially. ISIS still exists as an ideology that comes back and tries to attack and do violent terrorist acts, but they are not a caliphate anymore. the U.S. government, through international aid and diplomacy, is working really hard to try and create a situation where those Christian communities that were displaced from those ancient, communities are able to return and rebuild. A huge amount of aid work, a huge amount of diplomacy has gone into this, and it's a tough challenge. You have a community that, this data is staggering, that since 2003, the Christian community in northern Iraq has dropped by 90%. So 1 in 10 remains. Most of those were forced because of persecution to flee, whether to be to Jordan or Lebanon or the West or Australia. But many were killed, and so it is a astonishing and staggering reality. And so right now, what's being fought for by the Christian community there, by the Iraqi central government, they are now, through much pressure from the U.S. government engaging, is to create a space for those Christian communities to rebuild their homes and villages that were destroyed, rebuild their churches, rebuild their businesses. Some towns we're seeing a bright spot, other towns there are still not coming back. So there's much work to be done. But I would say for those communities, the thing to pray for is around security. They still fear for their safety. And we can get into more detail here if it's of interest, but there are militias who came to northern Iraq to fight ISIS, who have subsequently been co-opted by the Iranian regime and now make the region unstable. So even though ISIS is gone, they still don't feel safe going home because of these militias that came to fight ISIS initially, but now are acting sort of as Iranian proxies.
Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. What, for the people that you meet with when you travel to the Middle East, or that you are talking to, the true answer is that it's Jesus Christ, but what keeps the hope when it feels like there's so many obstacles, and to just like the one you just mentioned, where it seems like things were finally.
It is to me, it is extraordinary, the resilience of Middle Eastern Christian communities, and just the way that they exemplify Christ through their lives, through just incredible hardship. I want to share just, many of you probably saw photos of the 21 Coptic martyrs who were killed by ISIS on a beach in Libya. And that became sort of an internationally known incident. It was horrific. Shortly after that occurred, a brother of one of those Coptic men who was killed, was on a radio program, a Coptic radio program in Egypt. And the host asked him, if you were to find, or if you were to meet one of these ISIS fighters, what would you say? How would you interact? What would you want to say to him? And the brother of this man who'd been martyred said, he said, I'm really glad you asked me that question, because my mother and I actually had this conversation. And he said, my mother told me, she said, son, if one of the men who killed my son was in the street and needed water, as a follower of Christ, it would be my job to bring him into my home and give him water and welcome him. And that is my responsibility, and that our first responsibility as followers of Christ is to forgive. And that, to me, there's that's just an astonishing example of the gospel, sort of in action, in statement, in word, in deed, and is just very powerful. So yeah, I would say what I have been astonished by and just personally challenged and encouraged is just the resilience and faith and commitment of these believers. And we heard many of them talk about the fact that, especially those from Iraq, just saying, that when everything else is stripped away, the thing that they're able to hang on to that keeps them from losing all hope is their faith.
Is their faith. Yeah. I would love to see, and for those listening who are in charge of those, the prayers of the faithful for masses who write those, I really, I would really love to see in every single mass, in every single church, around the world, that every prayers of the faithful in mass would include prayers for the persecuted church. It doesn't have to be the whole persecuted church around the world. And sometimes it's included, sometimes it's not, but I have to wonder why it's not there in every, so this is just my personal shout out to women who might be in control of prayers of the faithful at Mass. It should be in every petition.
Mm.
The Tertullian said the blood of the martyrs is the seeds of the church. We're being nourished by the sanctity of those who spill blood for Christ. And so why are we not more proactively interceding for it? Peter, I don't know if you get to work with, educational outlets and whatnot, but when I was a high school teacher, and I taught church history and moral theology, and one of the projects we had, I think you'd like this, is in the church history section, we would be going through the persecution era of the early church, before Constantine legalized Christianity and all that. And we'd take a pause from church history, and we would then come to modern day persecution. And I would kind of just show them a map of the whole world and all of the places where human rights and religious freedom violations are occurring. And each student class had to choose a country. And sadly, there are just that many countries where Christians are persecuted. Christians are the minority, and Christians are persecuted for their faith, whether it's communism or Islam or whoever the persecutor happens to be. But it was shocking to the students that this is like a real thing that still happens. They're not aware of it, and they're in high school, so you can kind of understand, people are, we just don't know until we know. And but I would love for the awareness of the persecuted church to be at the forefront of every Christian household and every Christian family. So I thought you'd like that we did that project, and every high schooler that took my class had to go deeply into the source and the situation of and it wasn't just Christian minorities. Christians are usually the largest minority in a lot of these countries, but other minorities too, like you mentioned, the Yazidis who are persecuted for their faith. And it's not about politics or economics. It is about Christianity. And I think that's the first thing we have to admit as well. So
I'll just say two things. I think that's so important what you did with your students. And I'll just say, I think that certainly coming from the Protestant world of the United States, the New Testament talks about the church as a body, and bodies have nervous systems. And I would say, I think the modern church has a bad international nervous system. Because some parts are literally getting destroyed and other parts don't feel it at all. And while I do think, I don't want to say that churches in the U.S. don't feel sometimes that they are, as Christians, they receive some maybe negative treatment or opinion in the public sort of sphere here as Christians. There's sometimes a sense that, our beliefs and our values are maybe unacceptable or not respected as they should be here. But I think sometimes that often I wish that there would be more of a realization, as you had with your students, of what is actually happening around the world, and sort of a strengthening of that nervous system, so that when one part of the church is so violently attacked, that the rest of the church would respond. And I also want to say that there are, we have a religious advisory board that is it has, members of many denominations, all the Middle Eastern churches as they appear. There's their manifestations in the diaspora, Protestant, Catholic, a couple cardinals, Cardinal Dolan, wonderful people who are doing incredible work within the church. So it is being done, but there's so much more that could be done.
There's so much more that could be done, and that's why I love Endow, and I love Endow women, because the women that I am in constant communication with Endow, who are in our small groups, are the sort of women who are those game changers of cultural renewal and spiritual renewal. So that's why I'm so excited for them to hear this conversation we're having, because they are just the sort of women who have so much in their heart, so much in their feminine heart, that want to do things. And I just want to let them know especially to the women that are listening, that feel, I number one think that prayer and fasting is crucial. But for those who maybe want to get a little bit more involved and educated on this, because we talk a lot about discovering and cultivating your feminine genius at Endow. Well, there are certainly women out there who are part of Endow who might feel this call, or who probably already have it, but maybe need encouragement, resources, recognition, have never heard of In Defense of Christians, if that's the route that they want to take in becoming more involved, who maybe are going to refine their call, their mission from God into this particular aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So, and just thinking out loud, just a random tangent, I was just thinking, I wonder if parishes around the world, imagine if each one adopted a country to build relationships with and adopt. I don't know, maybe that's being done in some parishes, I don't know, but if not, I think that would be a really cool idea.
I think there's some attempts, and I know I've heard this talked about many times, to sort of adopt a parish adopting another parish, and sort of I think that has happened in some cases, but I think it could be done, much more widely, and I totally agree with you. I think that would be, a wonderful way to educate and learn and really lean into that sort of, body of Christ realization that, your reality is not necessarily the same as other churches' realities, and sort of sharing those burdens, bearing each other's burdens is part of the call of Christ, right? And I think, to actually do that, it's often messy. Carrying someone else's garbage out is not, is not the most glamorous thing you're going to do, right? And so it's often messy, and I think sometimes it's scary to lean into that. But as much as churches can find ways to embrace the suffering of other saints, I think it is enriching and the right thing to do.
I love that. And on that subject of kind of the sacrifices that it takes. So I know we're running, we're getting close to time, but there's a few questions I want to ask you before we end this conversation. So obviously, as Christians, we should care about our persecuted brethren. We should care about anybody that is being hurt in any way. But is there another incentive that you can provide for why should we have, especially care about religious freedom in this particular way?
I think there's a host of reasons to care. I think one thing, especially coming from the United States, that you shouldn't underestimate is the unique access to it that you have here. And I think we realize that maybe in sort of a anecdotal, or not anecdotal, but sort of a a general sense that oh wow, we often in our churches and our parishes talk about we're so grateful for the freedom that we have here, and that's wonderful. But it's, I think, until you sort of look at the way other communities are treated, you maybe don't really have that sort of heightened awareness of how wonderful and how blessed we are here. And I think from that blessing, we should look at how we can reach out and extend that to others, because the U.S. is, being an American citizen, living here, growing up here, having access to your government, whether it be your local congressman or your local state legislator, or even your county or city board or commission, is an incredible gift and opportunity that most people don't have. And what is said in the United States, believe it or not, I know a lot of people maybe think that, maybe we're not viewed very well around the world. And there are plenty of people who don't like us. But what is said and done in the U.S. ripples out. Mm-hmm. And we are a leader, for better or worse. And I think as believers, we should step into that and say, okay, with this, sort of the Spider-Man, with this great power, what is the responsibility that comes with that, right? And I think that is actually a biblical truth, right? That, to whom much is given, much will be required. And so I think as believers in the United States, we should look at how do we lead, not just in our own communities, but actually looking towards what message are we sending to other countries.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think even my parents as kids in Cairo, everyone pays attention to the United States. I know as a first generation immigrant, again, Andrew Dorn and those who were founding IDC, it meant a lot to me personally that there was an all-American, right, who cared about the situation of Christians in the Middle East. And then, yes, whether they hate us or love us, it doesn't matter. But they care. It's really important. So for the women who, maybe this conversation will ramp up like prayer and fasting and getting involved with your parish and raising awareness and all of that. For those who want to get more politically involved in defense of Christians, and again, a reminder, this is a bipartisan issue. Yeah. And it truly is. How can they get involved? What in your mind, Endow women are listening and they are like, I want to get involved in defense of Christians more actively. What very specific things can they start to do to be part of the grassroots movement of these IDC chapters or all the other things you're offering? So if you could speak into that.
So first of all, and I say this realizing that you may think, this is sort of cliche, but the first thing you do is actually just as simple as like just go on our Facebook page and like our Facebook page and just see the news and use that as a way to start educating yourself. If you're on Twitter or Instagram, just go there and just start tracking what is going on, what's happening to these communities. And just, you don't have to, I wouldn't, this is not, you're not signing up for a PhD program. This is not a huge commitment, but just, investing a little bit of time over the next few months and weeks in reading about these issues and seeking out places. There's a lot of wonderful Catholic publications that cover these issues regularly. What is happening to Christians in Nigeria, Copts, what is happening to the Coptic community in Egypt, what is, with the sort of the instability and threats to the Christian community in Lebanon, and so on. The list goes on and on. So just in taking a little bit of time, making a small time investment to educate yourself is a huge first step. And you have to, and that's where you have to start. But from there, we would really encourage you to look at. You can reach out to IDC and we can help you do this. We help people do this all over the country. But you can set up a meeting, and this is incredible. I don't think most people realize this. It's very easy to set up a meeting with your local congressional office and walk in and say, hey, I vote for you, or I vote in your district, and I really care about X issue. And it doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. We work with with the farthest members on the far left and the farthest members on the far right, because this is really one of the only issues right now that draws consensus, which is beautiful. And you can walk into that office and say, hey, this is something I care about. This is what I've been studying. I've been learning. I'm really worried about this. Do you have an opinion? What are you doing? My job, I can meet with their staff here, and I do constantly. But my voice, I'm one of 1,000 voices talking to them here. When you show up in their office as someone from their community and say, I care about this, they're listening and they're paying attention. And that makes, my job 100 times easier here when I come to them and say, hey, I would like you to work on this. This is something we care about. They say, oh, well, what? Our community cares about that too. And so this is a priority for us. So something is, and I think for a lot of people, they hear that and they think, oh, that's sort of like meeting, I can't do that. You totally can. It's incredibly easy. It's a phone call and email. It's very simple to do, and it has a huge impact. So I think just something like that, if your local chapters would say, hey, we're going to study this for a month, and then we're going to have something that is on our heart. We're going to call our local congressional office and go sit down with them for a 20-minute meeting and share that. They would love to hear from you, and the impact would be far beyond what you could even realize.
I love that so much. And I'm assuming that they can call In Defense of Christians and just say, yes, I'm about to do this. Like, we
can give you resources. Yeah. We can help connect you with the right people in the office, help you organize those meetings. Yes, we do all of that for people all over the country.
So it'd be kind of interesting if, like, say some Endow women are listening to this and they find out, this is, again, I'm just thinking out loud here, find out where, Middle Eastern churches may be, probably this will have to go Eastern Catholic, and maybe build bridges with them, start educating themselves, like the Facebook page. But regardless of whether you do any of these other things, making that appointment with your,
Simone, that's a really good idea that you just shared. And I would encourage that. I think I was sharing with you earlier. I grew up, in a community that had a Armenian Orthodox church just down the road that it wasn't until I moved to DC and started working for IDC that I realized that church existed, right? So my guess is if you Google, if any of your listeners were to just Google Coptic churches in my area, or Maronite churches or Chaldean churches, they would be blown away to see the map light up with 2 or 3 in their city or in their town or region. And I would encourage you, just take one Sunday morning and just go and sit through a service, say hi to people, and meet the community. And I think you'll be blown away about how beautiful, how rich, how different it is from what you're used to. And it'll just be enriching and encouraging.
I love that. It would also be an exercising a missionary charism. I'm sure there are women listening who have charisms in mercy and missionary discipleship. So that attraction to other cultures, I think you're out there, women. I know you are. So thank you so much, Peter. Is there anything else that, before we say goodbye, that you'd like to share with our women, or that you think they should be reading, or movies they should be watching? Anything that you want to just recommend?
I'll just share maybe just one story in closing. There was, I got to visit, there's a region in Lebanon that's referred to as the Holy Valley, and it's where there was a Islamic expansion throughout the region, and a lot of monks hid in this mountainous valley in caves, and they built monasteries actually in caves. It's extraordinary. They're active to this day. And while we were there, we got to go into one of these monasteries, and it was actually the weekend of Orthodox Easter. And there were monks who'd been in this monastery, hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, and it's extraordinary. The ceiling of the monastery is half cave wall, half brick. So it's and they were singing prayers in Aramaic, language of Jesus Christ, right? So it was this just astonishing experience to realize, that this tradition had existed for hundreds of years, and was sort of right there in the the eye of the storm for so many generations, and that these people have been faithful and continue to serve in this little monastery built in a cave, and so I just leave that as just sort of an image to just remember that this is something really beautiful. It's worth preserving, and it's not easy to preserve. It's in threat. It could disappear even in our lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think that should be a call to action and an encouragement that it does exist, and a call to action to try and do what we can in our little part to preserve it. And I think the encouraging thing is the church is universal. It's large. We're not alone in this. And so you don't have to feel overwhelmed by these things, but I think you can be encouraged to get involved.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. It's been a delight talking to you, and I want to personally thank you for all that you've done on behalf of persecuted Christians in the Middle East. So thank you so much.
An honor. Thank you, Simone. Appreciate you having me on today.
Thank you.